Hello everyone and welcome back to the Little Quilter. Today we're just going to review the legendary quilt by Elizabeth Hartman and how this quilt came out for me, any sort of things that I just wanted to touch base with you guys on what I learned, what I liked, what I didn't like about this quilt. And I always like to do a little bit of a quilt review. Now I will be honest in that I haven't had much time to sort of think about this quilt because I have been on a deadline to get it done and get it to my friend because she does want to give it to her mother as a present. And so with that deadline, I'm pretty much finishing it on like the last day before I need to give it to her. So I don't really have a lot of time to sort of reflect on the quilt, but I like to review it, so we're going to go ahead and do it. I literally just got the binding done here. And it was this, show you guys here, that is the fabric that they gave me for that. And of course that's the background as well, to give you sort of that sneak peek of what the background looked like. And this is a flannel fabric that I just got from Joann's Fabric, and I really liked it. So now it really turned out well for this quilt. It was kind of, for me, a little bit of a jump for that. I knew I wanted to do a flannel because it's Sasquatch and Bigfoot, and I feel like flannel and that kind of goes together. I don't know why, but I feel like it goes together, and so I knew I wanted a flannel. It was kind of, you know, it's a punchy color, but with all of the green from the trees, that's why I ended up choosing that. So, as I was saying, this is the legendary quilt by Elizabeth Hartman. If you're interested in watching me piece this quilt together or any tips and tricks for putting this quilt together, then check out those videos. Otherwise, this is the lap size quilt, and it finishes around 60 by 72 inches, and I think it comes together really well. I definitely think it is certainly beginner friendly for any quilter level. If you are a seasoned quilter, I think this is going to just be a really relaxing quilt to make, something that you can kind of just do and put your favorite YouTube channel on and watch it. Or while you sew, or for those who are beginners, something that's going to be repetitive and help you kind of learn sort of what you need to do whenever you're making a quilt. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is thread. So, sorry, there's a big, I don't know if you guys can hear that. There's a huge thunderstorm happening right now. So I like to use Magna-Glide bobbins and glide thread. These are my go-to threads for my long arm quilting, and I originally was going to choose 4 thread colors. I was going to do a cream on the background, a green in the like a Kelly green in these, and another green, the celery green, and I ended up, and then of course the brown and all of the brown portions of this quilt. I ended up deciding to narrow it down to 2. I don't like thread changing. It is so not my favorite thing to do. I always, you know, even whenever I get a new bobbin, it always gives me a little bit of anxiety of, am I going to have to fiddle with the machine to get the tension and everything correct? It used to take me so long when I would hand wind my bobbins to get the tension right. I think I just have like leftover anxiety from that. Magna-Glide has been a lifesaver for me for that. I'm not sponsored by them. They don't send me thread. If they want to send me thread, that'd be great. But yeah, I have really enjoyed using the Magna-Glide bobbins and can't recommend them enough, especially if you're having tension issues in your long arm. So the colors that I ended up going with for the green was celery for both the bottom line and for the top line. Both of them are glide thread. They do have a bit of a sheen, as you can see, but I really feel like on the quilt that is not, you know, unless you're like really densely quilting, I don't feel like that sheen is super noticeable or something that's going to take away from either your quilting or your piecing. I think if you get really close to it, then you might notice it, but from afar, I don't really feel like it's that much different than any of the like superior threads or otherwise. For all of the brown, I used the cocoa thread right here, and then I used the mahogany bobbins right here. Okay, so with regards to choosing a top thread and a bottom line, I purchase all of my thread from quiltedjoy.com. And basically, when you go in there and you choose a top line thread, they recommend a bottom line thread. And I basically always go with their recommendations. Sometimes they recommend the exact same color, such as in the celery, if there is a same color. If you don't have the same color thread, then they will recommend the closest match. Sometimes you get an option where they'll say like, here's a lighter version and here's a darker version, which is also nice, especially if your background is a darker background or your backing is darker, then maybe that's something that you would want. But I basically use whatever they suggest. So I would recommend them. It's just nice because when you're purchasing thread online, it can be really difficult. I always like to look at my thread booklet to see the colors, but it's still something that's just hard to match. And I don't have all of the colors for the Magna Glide bobbins. I don't know if they're actually the same. So it's hard for me to match those. And so letting them do that work for me is certainly worth it. And I have not been disappointed by their matches. All right, so the next thing that I think we need to talk about, and one of the bigger things for this entire quilt, was really this pantograph. So the pantograph is from Urban Elements. I believe it's called Baby Feet. And I did this pantograph by quilting it on the front of the quilt with a blue erase marker, water-soluble marker, and then going back and quilting it. If I could do every pantograph that way, I honestly think I would, even if I wasn't skipping objects, right? If I was doing this over the whole quilt. And the reason for that is I did feel like my quilting was a lot more determined from the front. I felt like I was in more control than I do from the back. And also you can see what you're quilting. You know, I know you have the little laser light that you're following, but it is really hard to imagine that in your mind's eye from the back of the quilt on the pantograph. And so if that is an issue that you've had, and one of the reasons why maybe you've not quilted with the pantograph, that might be an option of just attaching one of those water-soluble pins to the front of your quilt, going to the back, setting everything up, and then quilting it, or drawing it basically, tracing it from the back, come back to the front and quilt. And I really, really enjoyed this process. I just felt like the quilting was so much more fun, and it was still fast, right? So obviously it definitely took longer than if I just quilted it from the back, but in all honesty, this quilt, I think in total took me like 4 hours or something like that to quilt on the machine. So when it's recording, obviously there's a little bit more time because it only records when I'm actually running the machine. But all in all, if I had free motion quilted this background from my own idea, I am certain that it would have taken me longer. So I still appreciate the pantograph. And you know, people always ask when you're designing a quilt, are they quilt worthy? You know, is this person quilt worthy? And part of me hates that question because I enjoy quilting. And if I'm going to make a quilt for somebody, I want it to be how I want it to be. I don't want to think like, well, are they going to appreciate everything I'm giving it to them? That is my gift to them. You know, if they don't appreciate it, then that's on them. I don't feel, you know, I made the choice to make the quilt and give it to them. So I want to make it how I want to make it whenever I'm creating it. And I really wanted to do this pantograph, and one of you guys so thoughtfully wrote on there, why can't you just do it in the background, when I was considering free motioning or roller quilting all of these other details on the quilt. And I am forever grateful for that, because I don't know that I would have tried that or even thought about it of like, how could I do that? I just was like, well, maybe I could when I read that comment. And then it just sort of rolled from there. So I am so, so appreciative of that. And I love it when you guys comment, because a lot of you guys, even if you don't have knowledge of quilting, throwing an idea out that like that might spark something and spark that creativity and that imagination that I never thought I could do that. Why can't I do that? Or giving that idea out there, sometimes it just works really, really well. So I really appreciate that and love your guys' comments. And I love how the Pantagraph turned out. I also used this green thread color in the background on the Pantagraph, and it definitely was a semi-bold choice, especially doing a quilting technique that I had never done, because it shows up more. I mean, I feel like you guys looking at it right now, you can see it more, and some people might not like that. You know, they might like the ones that sort of blend more, and you could have done this in a cream and it would have blended more, I'm sure. But personally, I like that look. I worked really hard on this background and I love that it shows up. And it's still, to me, in my opinion, quite subtle, but it's enough that I feel like it just brings a smile to your face. Like you're like, oh, it's a Sasquatch. Oh, feet. Like, oh, that's very cool. So I am happy that it stands out a little bit more. It also has helped me to be a little bit bolder, I think, in my color choices. I'll say this, and then my next quilt, I'll use like the most bland color ever, but I promise I don't mean to do that if I do that. I just think it's sort of given me that idea of like, you know what? You don't have to match everything. Everything doesn't have to blend in quilting. If you're proud of a component of your quilt, or you just want to show off something in your quilting, then go for it. Use that color, do what you need to do. Okay, rant over. Now let's talk about the trees and the Sasquatch block. So the trees, I quilted all different but the same, meaning that every tree block and its companion tree are quilted the same except for one. The one that I messed up, which was the flannel one. Let's see. Oh, it's down here. Oh, man. So here is one of the flannel ones. This is actually the correctly quilted one. But the interesting part that I find is that I was so like, oh man, I messed up. I was supposed to do it this way. And then whenever I quilted it, I realized that basically I was eliminating like one element of the design. So basically these ended up being squares. And the other one is basically highlighting every little square. So each big square is bisected. And when I did that, I was like, oh, well, it's just an interesting way to think of it, because I was thinking, oh, this is so detailed. I'm following the pattern and everything. And then when you really look at it, you're like, oh, you're just like outlining squares and bisecting them in the grand scheme of things. So that's one thing I would say too, is sometimes we plan our quilts out and we plan our designs out, and then you forget, you think you did this or that, you don't have, you know, your drawing, you don't have your design there, and you just go with it, and that is okay. I'm totally fine that those two are different, and honestly, they're so minutely different that I don't even know if anybody will ever notice if they look at this quilt otherwise, but I'm okay with it. I think it looks fine, and I kind of like that there is that little bit of difference to them. You know, having that one unique, or these two unique trees that aren't exactly the same, which no tree in the forest is exactly the same. So yeah, don't be afraid to make a mistake and to just roll with it, because that's totally fine. To me, this is an art form. It's not a regimented, have to do this, have to do that type of thing. So very happy overall with how the trees worked out. I'll give you guys sort of view of those as well. And then the last thing that we kind of want to talk about here would be the Sasquatch block. So this block, I was trying to make him look really scraggly and really furry looking. I feel like he ended up looking more topographic. So how every sort of line was sort of outlining another and kind of circling back on it. It definitely had that topographic map feel, which I think really worked out for this quilt, and especially on the background of it. I think it looks really neat. And I will say that may be an interesting thing. So we'll talk about the background in a minute. But the background, like I said, I used 2 different colored threads for both the front and the back. So we'll talk about that in a minute though. The other thing that I did on the Sasquatch quilt was putting this little heart on here. I know one of you guys had recommended that I embroider it, and I really did consider that idea, but then I kind of realized that my embroidery skills are maybe not the best, and I was like, it's really going to stick out if I do like a red heart embroidery on this, and I just really wasn't confident enough to do that. You know, I think maybe in another quilt I might try that. And if I hadn't already sort of set everything up, you know, I could have used my embroidery machine to do a really beautiful heart on it. But I kind of had everything already put together when that idea came out there. And I'm okay with it. Especially when we think about the topographic map thing, it's really kind of cool to have that heart. It sort of stands out a little bit more against the background, which makes it really sweet, especially since somebody's giving it to their mom. And yeah, I think it's really sweet. Okay, so we kind of mentioned the back, so I think we ought to flip it over and I will show you the background. All right, so this is the background of the quilt, which I'll probably have to just do a little bit more of a close-up on it for you to really be able to see stuff on there, but I think it turned out kind of interesting. There's definitely, I think the interesting thing about the background is that I used 2 different color bottom line or bobbins, and you can tell that, but you can only tell it, I feel like, when you look really close. So I know that there's a tree right here, and I can kind of see that a little bit more on the background, but I also, there's a tree right here, and it's not as noticeable on this one. So it's just an interesting idea, because I always was sort of told, like, not told, but just thought like you should use the same bottom line or the same bobbin color for the entire quilt. And for me, if I can keep my bottom line and my top line pretty close in color, it also just helps with not battling with your tension as much, and having to have it dialed in exactly perfect. You know, if this was a completely white background, if this was, you know, a really solid color, I don't think that those color changes would be maybe as ideal. Like, I certainly wouldn't want it to have done that on the Kite in a Square block quilt, because I think it just would have been very distracting. But on a quilt like this, where my background is already pretty busy, and then the designing of the quilt is pretty busy, I just feel like it turned out fine, and I'm not worried about it. So if some of you guys have been hesitant to do that, you know, then maybe if you're thinking about it, you can look at your background or your backing fabric, or if you haven't purchased your backing fabric, maybe you purchase a backing fabric that would go well for this, because I do think that it really kind of just blends in. If you look really closely, yes, you can totally tell where every tree block is. You can completely tell where the Sasquatch quilting is, but I'm okay with that. And because everything is outlined, you can still also tell what it is. And so it does seem to make logical sense that the tree stumps would be brown, because in our head, the tree stumps are brown and the trees are green. So I think it's okay. Interesting, you know, I guess for me, I would wonder what you guys think. Is that something that you have routinely done, or you have definitely steered away from? Yeah. Okay, so I have flipped it back around, because although I routinely only worry about one side of the quilt, I also routinely am pretty enamored with the backs of the quilt. And honestly, for this one, I think because the fabric is so busy that the quilting is really kind of lost in the fabric, that I'm not as enamored with the back of this one. You know, and maybe it's just a lack of being interested in the back of the quilt after the kite and a square and all of the work that was put into that block and trying to keep it all lined up, that I'm kind of like, just whatever's on the back is on the back. But I think I do more so think that it's really just the fabric choice. It doesn't show up very well, which maybe that's the reason why the different color threads worked fine. The last thing before we go that I wanted to talk about was with the Pantagraph. I forgot to mention that I did use that blue Mark Begone marker. Now, I don't know that I used the exact marker that some people used. I just purchased it from Amazon, and they were like shorter ones, and they did erase, but I will tell you that there were a couple of spots I had to go back through and spray down multiple times. So if you have, this would probably not be a design that I would consider doing on or drawing on to some of the fabric. Now, if there are pins that you guys think are better for this type of thing where you're like, it never stays, it always washes out, please comment those down below, because I would love to know what pins you use and which ones work the best, because I do feel like there were some points in this quilt that I struggled, and that is why I've always been very nervous about using those, especially. And I'm really sorry if you guys can hear the thundering that is happening here. There's like a huge rainstorm happening. I'm just trying to get the video done for you all. But as I was saying, I have always been very leery of using those on the quilt top or leaving them for a very long time because of the fear that it doesn't come out. And you hate to have made it that far in your quilt. You've pieced it, you've ironed it, you've basted it, you've stuck it together, you've put it on the quilting frame, you've got the backing, you've got everything, only to have a dadgum blue line stay on your quilt. Oh my gosh, that would be so disappointing. Has that ever happened to you guys? Let me know if that's ever happened to you. I hope not. That would be so depressing. I did use Natalia Bonner's trick of using cornstarch in there, and I linked that in one of the videos to her video where she talked about that, of what ratio that she used. And I would definitely recommend doing that, because I definitely feel like the blue line came out better. But it was very nerve-wracking, and it's something that I just don't know that I'll ever be comfortable with leaving it on a fabric for very long, or even after I've quilted it. So, all right, everybody, I can't think of anything else to review on this quilt. If you guys had any questions about it, please leave them in the comment section below. If you are wanting to see anything else from this quilt, please let me know. And I'll make sure at the end to put a large picture of it up, because I know a lot of you guys want to just see the entire quilt in its entirety rather than in a sort of video landscape kind of panographic view. So I will make sure that that's up there. And as always, have a wonderful day. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know if you guys have questions. Thanks.